Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 151, February 5th to February 11th, 1864. Last week, we talked about action in North Carolina with George Pickett's attempt on New Bern. Despite maybe some promising numbers, he would fail ultimately in his stab at the coastal city. This would include some almost successful joint naval operations and the capture of the USS Underwriter. We also headed out to Mississippi to go over the Meridian Campaign, something that is overlooked on the part of Sherman. This week, we have a main event in the famous escape from Libby Prison. Before we do that, though, we need to see some action further afield in Virginia and spend some time talking about Florida. Of course, before we get into that, we need to talk about some Patreon content, and here in January and February, we've had kind of back-to-back episodes that we've posted here, and we did a statistical analysis, and that was a little bit different of a episode than we've normally done, but just kind of taking a look at generals and casualties in the major battles of the war, and kind of running through some of those numbers. We also have the Red Badge of Courage starring R.D. Murphy, and there's a movie review for that should be posted as well. So we have January and February covered. We're going to hopefully be doing The Beguiled, another movie review in March here. So stay tuned for that. So that's what we have on tap. And if any of that sounds good to you, we're going to be probably doing some picture slideshows coming up here shortly as well. So if any of that sounds good, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. On February 6th, we have the Battle of Morton's Ford across the Rapidan. Now, it's been a little bit of time since the dust had settled from Rappahannock Station and Mine Run, but there would be additional campaigning on the part of the Army of the Potomac, even this early in 1864. John Sedgwick was temporarily in command of the army, but it would not be Uncle John's brainchild of a demonstration across the river. Benjamin Butler is a name we have not heard in some time, and he has been commanding at Fort James on the peninsula. Butler would assume that since there was action going on abroad elsewhere in Virginia, then it would mean the forces defending Richmond would be weaker. With Longstreet having been in East Tennessee and now Pickett with a substantial force in North Carolina, this was not necessarily a wrong assumption, but the rebel line was still pretty strong. Additionally, we mentioned that Pickett's forces had been cobbled together from other locations and did not really sap the strength of the Army of Northern Virginia to the degree that Butler probably supposed. Sedgwick would not want to conduct any operations, but the Lincoln administration was interested in maybe making some headway. They were frustrated, especially when compared to gains made elsewhere, that nothing was being done about Lee and his army in Virginia. Meade, as we have documented, had not followed up Gettysburg with a crushing victory as they had hoped, so without Meade, and with the idea of Butler on the table, it seemed maybe a good time to take a crack. If you're taking a look at it from the part of the Lincoln administration too, if Meade is away from the army, and then there is some pretty successful headway, that kind of gives you your answer about whether this is the right guy to be leading the forces that you have pitted against Lee, right? So that's kind of another reason why maybe if he's not there, we got a more aggressive commander that can get results, and then, we can safely take away the hero of Gettysburg because he's still kind of riding high, at least in the public perception of that victory. Morton's Ford along the Rapidan would be the target of the Union thrust, being led by the 2nd Corps commanded by John Caldwell in the absence of Gouverneur Warren. Facing them would be Edward Johnson's division of Ewell's Corps. On February 6th, in the winter conditions, the 2nd Corps troops would cross the river and engage the Stonewall Brigade. Alexander Hayes' division would be leading the attack, but while forming up, Ewell would respond in strength. It would be apparent for the Union troops that they were in a tough position. The aggressive Hayes would attack, but be repulsed, forcing the several brigades who crossed the river to retreat. Union casualties were around 252 compared to 79 Confederates. Both sides would recognize that there had been heavy campaigning and settle in for winter. So even when this action is happening in, shall we say, the main theater of the war, Butler actually doesn't really do anything on the peninsula. So it's not like they were leaving him high and dry. If anything, Butler was sort of leaving the Army of the Potomac high and dry by not advancing at all. And amazingly, it is his idea, but he also thinks that he's facing more strength than he maybe had previously assumed, so that's why he calls off the attack. John Caldwell is also going to kind of get the boot after this as well, right? We kind of mentioned him in Gettysburg and the lead up to that, but he's sort of going to be put on the bench as well. So even in this winter stage of the war, there are ramifications for poor performance. Soon Lee would see the arrival of his ultimate protagonist and a true shift in the war in the East, so stay tuned. We have a letter from Sam Moore, who serves in the 2nd Virginia. I think it is important to read this one because it gives us not only a brief insight into the action, but also camp life and examples of what soldiers would write about. Since I wrote my last letter, we have the quiet of our camp life interrupted by a note of war. On last Saturday morning, we heard the first time for some months past the familiar sound of cannons firing, and at once supposed that we would be, in a short time, have orders to march from our camps. About the middle of the day, orders came in to move at once, and swallowing a hasty dinner, I was soon in the saddle and had our brigade in motion for the scene of action. We marched very rapidly, and a little after dark reached the point about 12 miles from our camp where the enemy in some force had crossed the river. They had crossed at Morton's Ford, where General Walker's brigade, the Stonewall Brigade, was picketing, and had succeeded in capturing the guard of 1 lieutenant and 20 men of the 4th Virginia Regiment, who were at the ford, and who bravely disputed the passage of the river. General Walker met them with his brigade of Rhodes's division, both of which brigades were fortunately near at the time and hold them in check until we got up. As soon as we arrived on the field with our brigade, Stafford's and Battle's brigades, we formed in the shape of an inverted V with each flank of our line resting on the river, and the enemy in the inside of our formation. The darkness of the night prevented us, however, from making any attack upon them, as it was so dark that we could not have told friend from foe, and we were therefore compelled to lie all night in the line of battle, awaiting the return of daylight to make our attack. When day dawned, the enemy had concluded that discretion was the better part of valor, and retired under the cover of darkness to the other side of the river. They stood all day Sunday in line of battle on the other side of the river, obviously fearing that we were going to return their visit, and on that night fell back again to their camps. On Monday morning, we marched back to our winter quarters and have been quiet ever since. Our loss in the affair was 1 man killed, 3 wounded, and 21 captured. The enemy left 17 dead men and about 56 prisoners in our hands. Their wounded they carried with them, and we have no means of knowing how many they had. They made nothing by this advance. The prisoners stated that they had heard we were very weak and thought they could get possession of our fortifications by coming over, but they soon found out their mistake. Meade seems to be the most cautious general they have ever had, and if he crosses the river to go back again much oftener, he will lose his popularity with the hot war Yankees, who won a battle every few days to keep up their excitement. The fort at which they crossed is the same one that this brigade pickets, and we had only been relieved 2 or 3 days when they made their demonstration, so that we just escaped it. Simultaneously with this moment, a considerable force of Negroes and Yankees advanced upon Richmond by way of the Chickahominy swamps, but meeting with an unexpected resistance and finding our forces there in their front, ready to meet them, they fell back too, and so ends their last grand movement. The last letter I received from you as today is your number 12 of January 20th, since that number 10 has come to hand, which makes the complete set from 1 to 12, not one of them having failed, sooner or later, to reach me. So just 2 side notes there really quick. There is mention of in Benjamin Butler's army, there are black troops with him, so he does kind of mention that a little bit. So apologies for that. But we also have an interesting insight here in terms of numbering these letters so they know that they're getting there, right? Like, it's probably something that we don't necessarily think about with, say, modern messaging, text messaging, what have you. But, you know, if I'm sending a letter and I'm like, all right, this is number 1, and you don't get number 1, all you get is number 2, then obviously you're not getting that in time, right? So seems to be an interesting system. I am very anxious to hear from you again as regards to your own health and that of the little baby. I do trust that she may be spared to us and become a healthy child. Should my life be spared through this war, I should so much like to have a little daughter to share our home. But I must not suffer myself to think of this. You mention again the report concerning my promotion. Do not entertain any expectations or ideas on that subject. I am satisfied that, for some reason, which through unknown to me is yet no doubt a good and wise one, I am destined in military life, as I was in civil life, to have all my efforts to do faithfully my duty crowned with but a very limited success. For many years before the war, I worked as hard as a man could, and yet gained no more than a bare plain living, and knew in the army I have labored as hard as any man to do my duty faithfully, and to qualify myself for usefulness as an officer. And my advancement had been as slow as it was in civil life. I often come in contact with men far above me in rank, who it is no advantage to say I could teach the duties of their positions, and yet there is no such thing as promotion for me. I suppose one reason is that many of the other men get themselves pushed forward by means which I would scorn to use. However, I do not complain, as my position is a pleasant one, and I go along very well, and have every reason to believe that I have given satisfaction to General Jones. Indeed, he has told me so. And this is doing a great deal, for he is strict and exacting as a disciplinarian, and understands thoroughly his profession in all its various details. So I think this part is a particularly interesting insight, because he's talking about getting promoted, and that's like conversation that maybe some of us have had before in terms of, hey, like, I'm not getting this promotion, or I am, or whatever. So he talks more about that than the actual engagement that he's in to somebody at home, right? So that's, I think, an interesting insight here to view. Like, you can even hear somebody saying in the modern age, hey, I'm doing the best that I can do, but I'm not getting promoted, but so-and-so is, and, you know, they're, whether it's nepotism or what have you, like, that's why they're moving up in the ranks of the company, right? That's a very human conversation. The staff bill, concerning which you made inquiries, has passed the Senate unanimously, but has been indefinitely postponed in the House of Representatives. I hardly expect it will be brought up again in the House, as there are now but 7 days remaining of the session. Congress adjourns on the 18th, and even if it passes the House, it is not certain that Davis will approve this particular bill. It is the same exactly that he did not sign last winter, so that promotion, in that way, seems closed to me. The prospects of your getting near me again are equally hopeless. Prices have gone up largely, of all the necessities of life, and unless something is done with the currency very soon, my pay will scarcely be sufficient to afford me alone a scanty subsistence. You may think that I take a gloomy view of these things, but I am relating the facts as they exist. I do not refer to the matter to cause you any unhappiness, but in reply to your inquiries, and because it is proper that you should know exactly what to expect. There is no help for it. You must remain where you are, and as long as the present state of affairs continues to exist, it is simply impossible for me to get to see you, and unless our army again advances, which I doubt, there is no other prospect before us but a long, long separation. Can you blame me for being sad in view of these facts? If you do, it is you who are unreasonable and not me. I do think it is a little bit interesting. He does kind of contradict himself there. He's like, I'm sad, but you shouldn't be sad. And obviously you're unreasonable if you think that I shouldn't be sad, right? So, you know, it is a little bit interesting too. I know I use that word a lot, and I like taking a look at these individuals because they are people, and you can kind of, how many times have you had a text message conversation that, you know, you're contradicting yourself, or you're talking to somebody who maybe goes back on what they just said, right? So this is kind of the 1860s form of that, writing this letter. I'm learning to do many things for myself that I never thought I could do, such as darning my socks, mending my underclothing. I put a watch pocket in my new pantaloons the other day, and yesterday I put 2 large patches in my old pants, as they were worn out where I sit down. You see, I'm getting quite handy, and someday may be able to help you to patch and mend for the boys, or darn your stockings for you. You asked me for news, but I really have none to tell of our army, except that I've related of the enemy's recent advance. And what little news I have of our army in the valley, I will not trust to paper. We have no news from the west, except that General Longstreet is organizing a very fine army in eastern Tennessee, which is rapidly increasing in strength and efficiency, that nearly all of western Tennessee has been abandoned by the Yankees, and that General Johnson's army, Bragg's, is in fine condition. So there you go. You have a little bit of maybe scuttlebutt or rumors, right? We know that General Longstreet doesn't organize a huge army, and the Union forces don't abandon Tennessee as part of that. Next summer, I trust, will tell a very different tale in that section. The impression now is that both armies in Virginia, ours and the enemy, will stand on the defensive, and the great struggle will be in North Georgia and East Tennessee when the campaign opens. Meade's army is not strong, and it is most probable that Grant will need reinforcements and will take up nearly all the troops. that Lincoln will have to spare. The siege of Charleston seems to have been virtually abandoned as a bad job. If I can get a hold of it, I will enclose you President Davis's address to the Army, which is, like everything from him, a noble one. So there you go. We have even more kind of misinformation here, but it's all speculation, right? At this point, Grattan really hasn't taken a hold of the Army yet, and obviously a soldier in the Confederate Army probably doesn't know what his plans are, so that's all kind of hindsight from us. I'm looking now every day for another letter from you, which I hope will be soon. The papers tell of an attack upon the Yankees between Berryville and Charleston by some of Mosley's men, in which the enemy were routed. I should like to have been there to see it and take a hand. I think I could fight better than I ever did upon the soil of my downtrodden home. My motto is, in for war, no matter how long or in what manner it is fought. Let me know whether or not your father got my letters. I have written him 2 recently, and will send him another before long. Give my kindest regards to him and your mother. I am sorry to hear that my friend W.D. McGuire is not in good health. Remember me to him, and tell him I will write him a letter before long. How is Miss Betty McGuire? Give her my love. You say she will be married soon. She had better take my advice and wait until the war is over. Such times as these, those who are married fare worse than those who are not, don't you think? Give my love to Scully and Noslar, and kiss to Lawson and the little one. How my heart yearns to see you all and give you his best and richest blessings is my constant prayer. I saw Berkeley a few days ago. He is well. Cleon has gone away on a 15-day leave of absence. I have not asked for a leave of any kind, have no use for one, as I have no place to which to go. Nearly everyone has had one in this winter. I sometimes get very tired of camp, but try to get along as best I can. Scully ought to write me more that he does, so as to improve his handwriting. Is Noslar learning anything? He is now over 5 years old, and getting to be a big boy. He ought to be reading. I have given you a long letter this time. Goodbye. So like I said, a pretty interesting look into the letters that you would receive. There was this action, right? He does participate in that, but he spends most of the letter talking about other things, right? He's more interested in what's going on at home, how his kids are doing, right? Sort of the state of affairs and everything, kind of gossiping about that, right? So it is a very human look into these individuals, whereas sometimes I don't think we get a very good view. We need to talk a little bit this week about Lake City, Florida. Is a fair question that you may be asking is, where exactly is Lake City and why are we talking about it? Well, Lake City is relatively in the center part of northern Florida. We have talked before about how the Union forces had seized Jacksonville. Well, in 1864, it would be time to potentially move further inland. A target would be the key city of Lake City, Florida, as it was a railroad hub connecting Jacksonville and the rest of the state to the northern areas of the Confederacy. A couple episodes back, we mentioned that while you do not hear too much about Florida regiments and the rebel army, the importance of the state would be found in the cattle that could be used to feed the Confederates. Obviously, where manpower was already scarce, the primary workers supporting this production would be the enslaved. Truman Seymour, who we have met before, would advance with forces out of Jacksonville, moving to Lake City in a multi-purpose effort. Destroy the railroad and disrupt the cattle operation, but also recruit any of the enslaved who wanted to move under federal protection. We have seen similar recruitment efforts in Mississippi, if you remember, from the Vicksburg Campaign. Seymour, you remember, had served in the East, including the Peninsula and Maryland campaigns, and more recently had been involved in the coastal operations around Charleston and Fort Wagner. He would send Union cavalry in the direction of Lake City, trying to destroy as much in terms of supply as he could. Standing in the way of the Federal Army, though, would be Joseph Finnegan. Finnegan was born in Ireland, but found himself in Florida, where he was a businessman before the war, working railroads and lumber mills. At the outbreak of the war, he was commanding Middle and East Florida. There had been a lack of action, but he would have Alfred Colquitt with him, who we have spoken of before. Finnegan would sell most of his lands after the war, eventually settling in Savannah, Georgia. On the 11th, Federal cavalry would make their way to Lake City, but skirmish with their rebel counterparts sent by Finnegan. The Confederate horsemen would drive off their enemy, meaning there would be no general destruction of the supply and rail line there. but the point was made that the Federals under Seymour would be on their way, so a battle, the largest in Florida, would be imminent. On February 9th, we have a great escape from Libby Prison. Remember, we have talked before about how poor Civil War prisoner of war camps were, Libby Prison being no exception, a converted warehouse. Conditions in the prison were particularly bad. As far as the structure went, as a warehouse, it was 3 stories. While the upper tiers were reserved for prisoners, the ground floors were held for the guards and the support functions. In one part of the first floor, there was an abandoned kitchen, which had been dubbed Rat Hell due to the large amount of rats that resided there. While that made conditions less than sanitary, it did provide an opportunity for the Union prisoners. The Confederate guards were not interested in checking in on the kitchen, and the straw that lay on the floor would be good for any kind of escape attempt. Much organization was taken in trying to get out of the prison. Several parties were put together, but they did have a lack of proper tools. To get to the kitchen, they were able to create a passage by knocking out a chimney. After 17 days of digging, the tunnelers made it to a tobacco shed in an adjacent warehouse. There needed to be an organized withdrawal. On the night of the 9th, groups of Federals would make their way through the tunnel and then walk out of the tobacco shed. Amazingly, the Confederates were so ill-prepared for such an event that they were able to calmly walk through the warehouse district. Because of the 1862 Peninsular and 7 Days campaigns, there were enough officers and men amongst the escapees who could guide the fugitives back to Union lines as well. Eventually, 109 soldiers would make their way out of Richmond, of which 50 would be recaptured, 2 being killed. So shocked were the guards that they did not find out of the breakout until the next day. We have an excerpt from the Richmond Enquirer describing the escape. Extraordinary escape from the Libby Prison, 100 officers homeward bound. At roll call at the Libby Prison yesterday morning, 109 of the officers in prison there were found missing. Further inquiry elicited the fact that they were not in the building, but the motive of their disappearance was, of course, an entire mystery to the remaining 1,000 or more of their fellow officers in the same building. A strict examination of the premises, however, revealed the manner of escape and disclosed a combination of ingenuity and enterprise highly credible to Yankee character. The prisoners being confined in an apartment on the 2nd floor from the Carey Street front of the building and the 3rd from the Dock Street front, it would naturally be supposed that an exit was impossible without attracting the notice of the exterior guard. While any movement to descend from within, it is equally reasonable to suppose, would be discovered by the guards who are, or ought to be, stationed within the prison. The descent from within was the method chosen by the escaping party, and that they encountered no difficulties in their way seems to leave the inference that no guards were within hearing distance of their immediate route. So there you go, you're kind of poking at how exactly were they able to tunnel, and nobody was able to hear the tunnel, and right, so they're doing it in a section of the building where the guards didn't want to go. They had managed, it seems, to cut in a very neat and noiseless way a square aperture in the floor in the eastern section of the building, through which they obtained access to the floor below, into part of the building formerly used for hospital purposes. In the floor of this apartment, they cut a similar aperture and gained entrance into the basement storeroom, a spacious apartment, but little used, under the line of Carey and 20th Streets, which embraced the northeastern angle of the building. Here they commenced a mining process, penetrating the east wall of the building and striking into Mother Earth, under 20th Street, and the sentinels upon it directly across into an old foundation in the lot adjoining the opposite factory building. The tunnel thus formed was about 3 feet in diameter and 50 feet in length. The earth displaced was scattered or hidden about their base of operations, the storeroom. This work, it is evident, must have occupied weeks of patient and energetic labor, a labor which was at last crowned with at least partial success. Why more than 109 out of the 1,200 did not avail themselves of the opportunity to get free does not appear, and it can only be attributed to the sudden appearance or manifestation of danger. By what signal or in what shape is equally mysterious. It is sufficient to know that through these traps and cut by this tunnel, 109 succeeded in making their way unobserved and disappeared from the adjoining lot into the darkness undetected. The number comprehends 11 colonels, 7 majors, 37 captains, 59 lieutenants, including the somewhat famous, or rather infamous, Colonel A.D. Strait, of the 20th Indiana Cavalry, captured with his command about a year ago by Forrest in northern Georgia. So I think we did actually talk about how Abel Straight is one of these individuals who does escape from Libby Prison, and we covered, of course, his raid riding mules into northern Alabama and then into Georgia, trying to get into Georgia, where Nathan Bedford Forrest is eventually able to run him down. I also think it is interesting, and granted, this is a Richmond paper, it's a Confederate paper, right? But they're talking about how, well, it's hard to believe how more people didn't escape, right? They're kind of putting their own spin on things, and how often do you see that, right, in media? Upon the discovery of the escape, measures were immediately set on foot to overtake the fugitives, but it is feared that they have gotten rather too much the start of their pursuers to admit anything like the recapture of them all. 4 of them, however, were recaptured at an early hour of the day, 2 captains and 2 lieutenants, a few miles below the city. It is supposed that the direction taken by them all, if indeed all have left the city, was towards the peninsula. But it is not unlikely that they have scattered in various directions, as a self-sacrificing means of securing at least the escape of a partial of their number. The regime of the Libby Guard has hitherto been considered admirable, and the occurrence of which an extraordinary escape as this comes with stunning effect upon the public. We presume the whole affair will undergo a strict examination. Until then, it would be premature to say where the fault lies. So there you go. They're also trying to make sure that they're not pointing the finger right at the guards, even though it sort of seems like it's their fault. It is quite the effort by the Union prisoners to escape, and obviously we've had another great escape in terms of John Hunt Morgan's escape, and now we have one on the part of the Union troops. Morale for the Union prisoners will be high after the breakout, where there would be panic amongst Virginia and the Confederates. Obviously, as we have discussed before, this was a tough look at the crumbling infrastructure and soft underbelly the Confederates possessed. As prison conditions will worsen, there will be a concentrated effort to save comrades incarcerated, as we will see later in the war. So, the response, especially considering this incident where it's happening in the capital of the Confederacy, is to make sure that these prisoner of war camps are going to be a little bit more remote. So, it's going to make it tougher for, if you're actually escaping, to make your way actually to safe lines of your comrades, but also it's going to make it hard to actually supply the camps, and ironically, that's going to make things worse for the prisoners there. So we will call it a day. This week we covered action at Morton's Ford in Virginia. This will be the last action before we get into the Wilderness Campaign and, of course, the Overland Campaign. Additionally, we talked about Lake City, Florida. This is in preparation for the Battle of Aleutice, which will be the largest battle in the state. Finally, we had the great escape from Libby Prison in Richmond. Next week, we will spend some time in Oklahoma, but we also need to head to South Carolina. Reason being, we have the first successful submarine attack. We need to talk once again about the CSS Hunley. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the Patreon, as well as website and Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.